Good afternoon. Welcome back to our discussion of South Carolina history. We were dealing with Reconstruction in the years after the American Civil War. And in my history, I refer to Reconstruction as the Civil War Part 2 because that, in essence, what it was. In April 1871, the United States Congress passed the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan Act, in an attempt to stop the violence in South Carolina and other southern states. The very next month, President U.S. Grant declared 9 upcountry counties to be in rebellion, and South Carolina was to be made an example for the rest of the country. It was another example of failure by the federal government. Many Klan leaders fled the state and the country. Prosecutors were overwhelmed by their task. 1,300 men were indicted, but after a year, more than 1,000 of those cases were still pending. 23 convictions, 67 guilty pleas, 38 acquittals, and 30 cases dismissed. It was a federal bluff, and in South Carolina it was called. The insurgency grew in violence, particularly in the upstate. And it's interesting, the most violent counties in terms of lawlessness and Klan activity were at the white majority counties, not the black majority counties. Between 1872 and 1877, it was a pretty violent period in South Carolina history. After Governor Moses was elected, Wade Hampton said it was time for white Southerners to dedicate themselves to the redemption of the South. And that's why in many older history books you'll see this period, particularly when it ends, is talk about the redemption of the state. Whites openly organized gun clubs and paramilitary units, and the white community successfully used the northern press to their advantage, stressing corruption and racial incompetence. In 1875, white Mississippians overthrew the Reconstruction government, and the South Carolina newspapers began to question, why not South Carolina? What's the difference? The Republican Party in the state was divided between corruption and reform wings. There'd been a flirtation with the fusion ticket of moderate Republicans and whites, but that failed. And the so-called straight-out tickets, you've got to vote either. Actually, from the Democratic Party, the white minority was you have to vote for all Democrats. You can't vote for any Republicans. And this is when the red shirts, Wade Hampton's red shirts, he spoke of force without violence, but his lieutenants had no such compunctions. There were racial incidents at Hamburg, in Charleston, at Cainhoy, and Ellington. Governor Chamberlain ordered the gun clubs disbanded. The Allendale Rifle Club did, but it became the Allendale Mounted Baseball Club. The Columbia Flying Artillery became the Columbia Music Club with 4 12-pounder flutes. And there was Wade Hampton's triumphal tour of the state in the fall of 1876. In the election in November 1876, both sides participated in voter fraud. Gary and his boys were too active in Lawrence and Edgefield, where there were more votes cast for Wade Hampton than there were registered voters in the county. Local Republican election commissions threw out the results as fraudulent. Because of irregularities, the 1868 Constitution allowed the General Assembly to elect the governor, and there were competing delegations in Columbia. Governor Chamberlain stationed federal troops in the State House and tricked the commander into admitting only legislators with commissions from local election boards or the Secretary of State. South Carolina seemed on the verge of civil conflict. Wade Hampton, from the steps of the State House, addressed an angry crowd and asked them to disperse. The Democrats, who had their own House and their own Speaker in the General Assembly, withdrew from the State House. The Republicans, organized under Speaker E.F. E.W.M. Mackey of Charleston, in the State House itself. The Republican Senate majority organized without difficulty. The Democrats organized their House under William H. Wallace of Union County, and the Republican-dominated legislature elected Chamberlain governor. A furious Wade Hampton, standing on the corner of Main and Gervais, said, "The people have elected me governor, and by the eternal God, I will be governor, or we shall have a military governor." For 4 months, South Carolina had competing governments. Taxpayers voluntarily sent their taxes to Wade Hampton's government. Republican officials had to go to Hampton to get money for their agencies. Governor Chamberlain's treasury was empty, and his governorship existed only because of the presence of federal troops. Now, national politics played into what was going to happen here in South Carolina. There was a disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and Mr. Tilden, who was the Democrat. 22 disputed votes from various states, including 7 from South Carolina, were all awarded to the Republican. White South Carolinians skillfully maneuvered in D.C. with federal officials and Hayes, and they came to the same conclusion as President Grant said. The whole Army of the United States would be inadequate to enforce the authority of Governor Chamberlain in South Carolina. Once inaugurated, Hayes issued the order for the withdrawal of federal troops. Chamberlain issued an angry proclamation denouncing the desertion of South Carolina Republicans by the federal government. And on the 11th of April, 1877, Chamberlain and his fellow Republican officials quietly abandoned their offices in the State House and left South Carolina. The second phase of the Civil War in South Carolina was over. Those who had lost in 1865 had won in 1877. The election of 1876 validated simply what everybody really knew. While Republicans were the de jure or legally elected government, Hampton and his white minority were the de facto government of South Carolina. The election returned to power the old pre-Civil War elite, and they attempted to recreate the world of pre-1860 South Carolina. It was a pretty fragile world. Remember when we talked about the casualties during the Civil War? More than 20% of the white male population between 18 and 45 died in the war. So when you talk about the old guard taking over in South Carolina, it literally was older men taking over. The conservatives, as they now call themselves, almost all attended college in the state, and most of them were alumni of the South Carolina College. Agriculture was more important than business. In the South, post-Reconstruction politicians were often called Bourbons or Redeemers. Only in South Carolina did they call themselves Democrats prior to 1880. In other southern states, young men led the revolt against Reconstruction, often new men, but in South Carolina, literally the old guard, older men, took charge. And people sometimes say, where did the Bourbons come from? Is that because they drank whiskey? No, it was a reference to the Bourbons in France, the Bourbon monarchy. When it was restored, it was said they had neither forgotten nor learned anything, and as a result, ended up losing power. That didn't quite happen yet in South Carolina. The old guard did take charge. Wilmot de Saussure said, those who are legislating do not look to the future. The policy that he could discern was present expediency. Basically, we're going to try to keep everything the way we can and go back as much as we can. These were old men, literally, who had been fighting for 16 years, and then 2 more years of consolidating power. Exit the Republicans. With Hampton's assumption of office, the Republican lieutenant governor resigned, and Hampton's running mate claimed the office. He swore in Democrats for all contested seats. Some Republicans resigned. The Republican majority of 6 disappeared in the state Senate, and it was tied 15-15 between Democrats and Republicans, but the new lieutenant governor always broke the tie. By the fall of 1877, 10 more Republican senators had resigned, and the Democrats had firm control of the Senate. In the House, members of the Mackey House were called before the bar of the Wallace House, which was recognized by the Supreme Court of South Carolina, and Wallaceites ordered to take an oath or be in contempt of the House. Some refused. There were resignations, expulsions, and outright chicanery used to reduce the Republican majority to a minority of only 37 members. And then the General Assembly went after the Supreme Court. Circuit Court judges' elections were invalidated, although Wade Hampton insisted that 2 of the 8 judges be Republicans. Wade Hampton, throughout this time of the resurgence of the old guard, always up to 1890, he was concerned about, we don't want to go too far because we don't want the federal power coming back in. There was a legislative committee on fraud, and the multi-volume report was designed particularly, or really just for propaganda. And there was plenty of fraud to document, but like other instances, it went overboard. It conveniently overlooked the financial reforms of Chamberlain, and it overlooked people like Martin W. Gary testifying before a taxpayer convention about the honesty of Wall Street bonds in South Carolina. If things were as bad as reported, why were only 25 people indicted? Only 4 were brought to trial and convicted, and Hampton pardoned them in a deal with the feds to drop election fraud against Democrats. The real purpose of the committee had been to blacken the reputation of those who ruled the state between 1868 and 1877, and they were successful. Reconstruction in South Carolina became synonymous with graft and corruption. Now, we've got some serious economic issues in South Carolina to deal with after the end of Reconstruction. White House and his allies wanted to honor state debts. That meant any of those crooked bond bills that had been engineered during Reconstruction. Gary and others rebelled, and about 12% of the state's bonded debt was repudiated. The rest was left in place. Then they passed a crop lien law in 1868. It gave lenders the first priority in debt repayment for farmers, but it only allowed those who controlled their own crops to be able to take out a lien or a loan. Thus, a tenant farmer could not get a lien, or loan rather, and sharecroppers couldn't either. It was amended in 1874, where landowners under certain conditions would get first claim over the bank, or the general store, more likely. There were tax exemptions to encourage economic development. And I almost said, what's new in South Carolina? That goes back to the 1870s, but that was not high priority for the old guard. They really were more concerned with agriculture. In January 1878, they repealed the crop lien law, and the state's agricultural sector collapsed. In March 1878, a new law was passed just in time for spring planting, even more favorable to landowners than the old one. They passed a law permitting townships to require the fencing of livestock, and this was hated by small farmers. Previously, South Carolina had been open range. The Bourbons were not necessarily anti-business, it's just that they were not as commercially oriented as their peers in other southern states. And they did not give away the state's timber resources, as did the Redeemers in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. There was a railroad commission which briefly regulated rates. In 1885, the General Assembly repealed a 10-year tax exemption for investing in manufacturing. And in 1886, passed South Carolina's first general incorporation law. Now, Economics 101, if you want to create a business, you don't want to be responsible for everything. You want to have a company, people buy stock, and so the company is responsible, but that has to be an act of incorporation. Prior to this general incorporation law, an individual company had to get a special act of the General Assembly in order to get incorporated. So the history of South Carolina being all pro-business is a pretty shaky model. You got to have that act of incorporation. And then there is the problem that won't go away, the racial issue. Wade Hampton and his circle were somewhat tolerant on the question of race. Hampton often credited 17,000 African Americans who voted for him with the margin of victory. In speeches at home and in the North, he spoke of racial harmony and political fair play, and he appointed 86 African Americans to public office. And under his administration, there was virtually equal funding for public schools. And since the overwhelming majority of students were black, actually more money was spent on black children than white. But that's something of a Pyrrhic victory. There wasn't much money spent on education, period. But looking at what happened later in the 1890s, the fact that Wade Hampton said, okay, we're going to fund education, but it's going to be funded for everybody across the board. The News and Courier in 1881 applauded the conservatives' moderation. Far from the Democratic leaders in South Carolina being determined to maintain the color line, they have worked assiduously and patiently to obliterate it. In 1878, Hampton won re-election overwhelmingly with the support of black and white voters. There had been no Republican candidate. In 1879, the General Assembly declared interracial marriages illegal, interestingly, over the strong objections of many white legislators. And then we got the question of what's going on in the counties. You might remember that under the 1868 Constitution, counties really had strong local government in South Carolina. In fact, once it was abolished, they've never had strong local government. In Orangeburg, Democrats regularly elected at least one African American to the General Assembly and to the County Commission. As late as 1888, there was an African American Democrat on the ticket in St. Matthews. Until the 1880s, the black majority in Beaufort was too powerful to consider sharing power with the white minority. But then there was a fusion plan and offices were divided. These will be for black Republicans, these will be for white Democrats. There was a fusion plan also in Berkeley County. The most successful and the best noted one was in Georgetown. Each party nominated candidates for specific offices. The Democrats in Georgetown got the sheriff, the clerk of court, and 2 county commissioners. The Republicans got the state senator, 1 representative, the probate judge, school commissioner, and 1 county commissioner. With the exception of 1 white Republican probate judge, all of the office holders in Georgetown County who were Republicans were African American. And the fusion in Georgetown County stayed place until a race riot in 1900. There have been several books, I would say there have been dozens of books written about South Carolina and the American South in the years after the Civil War. And one of the titles that's used by different authors is The Road Not Taken. Wade Hampton and his men generally have been absolved of abandoning racial moderation. Hampton, after his election to the Senate, seldom interfered in state politics, except to keep the vicious Martin Gary from being elected governor or senator. However, disenfranchisement of black voters did begin under Wade Hampton. The General Assembly passed a new election law, redrew precinct boundaries, reduced the number of polling places, especially in black majority counties. Does this have a familiar ring to it? Some black voters had to travel 8 hours to cast their ballots. Hampton lectured black voters on the dangers of making race a political issue, and translated that meant don't vote Republican. However, white bloc voting became the norm. Why? It's demographics, folks. From the very beginning, we've talked about the population of South Carolina. Remember, from the early 18th century until 1790, it was a black majority state. From 1820 until the 20th century, until 1922, it was still a black majority state. The 1880 census revealed that South Carolina was 61% African American. Only 9 counties, Anderson, Chesterfield, Greenville, Horry, Lexington, Oconee, Pickens, and Spartanburg, had white majorities, and each of these counties was at least 1/4 African American. One justification was that the Republicans had used all sorts of chicanery to enhance its power, so now the Democrats would use the same tactics. Party politics in South Carolina, but again, in 1880, South Carolina was the first time that whites used the term Democratic Party, and it was organized because it made it easier for the party to limit black participation in the political process. Because local clubs elected people to the county conventions. The county conventions, in turn, elected delegates to a state convention, which met twice in election years. A spring convention for the upcoming election, setting the rules, a summer convention for nominating candidates, and elected state executive committee. In 1876, Anderson County instituted the first primary for nomination of local candidates, and other counties were to follow suit. In 1878, Gary got Edgefield Democrats to bar African Americans from participating in party politics and refused to recognize black Democratic clubs. And statewide, that brought, to Gary's chagrin, a lot of condemnation, negative reaction from white politicians and the press. The Newberry Herald said the action was that of a half-civilized people. Yet within 5 years, efforts to further reduce black voters had gained considerable steam across the state. The first effort at disenfranchisement was the 8-box ballot law. It originated with an esteemed lawyer, Edward McCready of Charleston. McCready argued that only literate persons be allowed to vote, and he actually proposed a literacy test. There was no support in the General Assembly because 22% of the white population was totally illiterate. They could not read or write. And so this was McCready's solution. There'll be 8 separate boxes for the various constitutional officers in South Carolina. And voters were given 8 ballots. And they had to go to the right box and put the right ballot in the right box. They had to come up with a registration certificate with name, address, place of employment, and if they moved, even within the same precinct, they had to pay to get their voting rights. Local registrars were given carte blanche to determine voters' eligibility. If a poor voter, and in upcountry counties denying the vote to the poor white was very common. People don't realize that, even during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. There could be an appeal to the registrar's process, but the process was designed to be complex and complicated to frustrate the poor and uneducated. Poll managers frequently switched boxes. So if you thought you were going in an order, you're voting for governor, lieutenant governor, on down the line, well, they'd switch it, and all of a sudden this is the Secretary of State, but if you walked in and put the governor's ballot in there, it didn't work, which means you also didn't get the right vote for the Secretary of State. The U.S. District Attorney in South Carolina estimated that 3/4 of the state's black voters were disenfranchised by the 8-box law. He brought suit, but no convictions, and the General Assembly appropriated money to defend crooked poll managers. County Democratic organizations now began banning black voters from participating in primaries. In Lawrence County, the Democrats would let any African American vote who could produce 5 white men who would testify that he had voted for Wade Hampton in 1876. In Williamsburg County, some blacks were permitted to vote, but a local historian said, "The spirit of South Carolina has been and is that only whites shall cast ballots." In 1876, there were 91,000 black voters in South Carolina. 12 years later, there were fewer than 14,000. In 1872, there were 92 black legislators. In 1890, there were only 7. A special congressional district was created in 1882. It's called the Black 7th District, and you'll see from the map, it bears striking resemblance to our current 6th District. If you look on the coast, somehow 2 segments of the 7th District are connected, and I guess there's a little path running up that keeps the Charleston city and the white vote going up through Orangeburg. It's geographically, I've gone back with students and checked the verbiage. We never could figure out how they made that work, but that's politics. But even with this plan to put as many black voters in one congressional district as possible, the reason being, get as many out of the white district so that the black vote won't have an impact. But even with this plan, 5 out of the 7 districts in the state had black majorities. It's just that the black voters were disenfranchised. Only the 3rd and 4th districts in the upcountry had slim white majorities. However, despite black majorities, only in this 7th was an African American elected to Congress. The last one was George Washington Murray of Sumter County, and he was defeated for re-election in 1896. One of the enduring myths about the return of the old guard is there were no black officials in South Carolina after 1877. That's simply not true. At the local level, in Georgetown until 1900, in Beaufort County into the early 20th century, and you've got Congressman Murray in Washington until 1896. The result, in consolidating their position, whites did to blacks what had been done to them during Reconstruction. And African Americans, just as whites had withdrawn from civic life between 1868 and 1876, African Americans withdrew from public life. Violence, lynching became a real threat to the black community, and rape or even the hint of disrespect to a white woman could lead to a lynch mob. There were mobs and riots in Union County over the fencing law, nothing to do with race, but simply mob violence. Newspaper editors were roughed up, and Francis Dawson was murdered on the streets of Charleston. The Cash-Shannon duel of 1880, Shannon's neighbors wanted to lynch Cash, resulted in the state's anti-dueling law. And personal violence infected all levels of South Carolina society. The murder rate in South Carolina was 3 times that of all the New England states put together, with a population 4 times as large in New England. The white minority was responsible for the largest number of killings, and their victims were mostly fellow whites. Violence was blamed on the prevalence of guns and whiskey. However, another legacy of Reconstruction and the insurgency. During a regular war, men take up arms in support of a legitimate government. However, during an insurgency, by its very nature, it makes a virtue of defying authority and violence. And South Carolina, in the years after Reconstruction, was Exhibit A to social dysfunction caused by insurgency. And I think I will stop here, and we'll continue at a date to be at a future date.